Well, Kevin, how you doing?
Doing good.
Good, man. So, dude, you like accomplished something that you've been talking about ever since I've known you, probably, 10, 15 years ago, right? You got that big book published. Hold that thing up. I think people deserve to see how thick that book is.
Ah,
Woo! That is might be as thick as the Bible, my man.
yeah, it's 4.5 inches thick.
Wow.
It's huge.
Holy cow.
Giant.
Okay, so why don't you tell us what that book is exactly?
Okay, well, let's start with a little story. It's when my dad began this work. It was in 1963. He laid on the couch at Dugway Proving Grounds, fell asleep, and in the middle of the night, an angel came through the window, stood about 1.5 feet above the ground, and he had a giant book in his hand, big book. And he said it was about the size of the History of Utah by Whitney. And Whitney's book is pretty close to this. When we put it together, it looks we're pretty similar. And and while he was there, the angel opened it up and he looked inside and turned the pages, and the angel was turning the pages, and he saw different subjects, different gospel subjects, united order, the gathering, rebaptism, just subjects that my dad kind of had in his head from early days of the church that we've kind of given up a lot of things. And so and so my dad was looking at it and he was like, wow, this is how I would write. And then he got thinking, maybe I wrote this book. And he looked up at the angel, and the angel nodded his head, yep, like
Okay.
and then he shut the book, and then out the window he went. That's how my dad said, out the window he went. And so so then he woke up the next morning and he thought, maybe I'm supposed to write this book. And so he started writing down the subjects that he saw, and a little, it said Ensign To The Nations, and it had a little flag on it, and all this kind of stuff. He wrote it down. And so then that was where he began. And then Dad started writing a book called Jesus Was Married. And Jesus Was Married was how this whole thing began. And he started writing different gospel subjects, different things that are a little bit maybe controversial in some aspects, but it was the way it was back in the early days of the church. And so so there's some really beautiful doctrines and different things inside the book. That's kind of how it all.
Interesting. And now, so is this your dad's like complete works in one book? Is this what that is?
This is everything we could pretty much find. My dad did do a book on astronomy that never got published, and we lost the manuscript. I don't know where it went, but that was another story. But other than that, that's pretty much everything we could find on him.
And I know that this was something that your dad really was passionate about. I remember you telling me the stories. So as you kind of take over the business, if you will, or you kind of pick up your dad's mantle to keep going here. Why, when did you discover, hey, this is something I have to do, right? Because that was kind of your dad's vision. When do you feel like it was impressed upon you that it was yours to finish, right?
So my dad found out that he had cancer and that it was an aggressive one. And, being at Dugway the many years that he was, and around all the nuclear and all the other bad stuff and the inks and the chemicals. And, he felt like he did pretty good getting 75. He wasn't sure how long he would live. Um, and he came to me and he said, "You remember Lundwall?" And I said, "Yeah, I remember N.B. Lundwall. He came to our house a lot and different things." And one time when I was a kid, I walked in. We stayed at Lundwall's house in Salt Lake City, and I was just I don't even remember how young I was. It had to have been 4 or 5 or something. And I had these little pajamas on with little swishy feet. And anyway, I wanted to get something to drink or eat or something. I went into the kitchen, and as I walked into his kitchen, it was in the middle of the night. There was this angel standing there, and I'm just this little guy looking up, and there's this white all through the room, and here's this angelic being there. He didn't really say anything to me; he just kind of smiled, and then just out he went. Just kind of like my dad, and I wasn't real scared or anything. I knew what had happened. But the next morning I came in and I said, because Dad always talked about apostles and seeing Jesus and all this. And I said, "Well, is N.B. Lundwall like an apostle?" And my dad said, "Well, kind of, not like, the guys in the church, but I would probably give him that title. He had probably gotten to that point where he'd seen Christ. I don't know." But N.B. Lundwall was very aggressive at finding old stories or old records and a lot of things that were in the archives of the church. And when N.B. Lundwall died, he was pretty close to our family. He told my dad, he says, "Well, Ogden, I'm dying. You're going to have to take over the baton, and you're going to have to, keep these things alive as best as you can." And printing and whatnot. And Dad had already kind of had the commission by that time, by this angel. And so then when Dad found out about the cancer, he turned to me and he said, "You remember that story I told you about Ensign Lundwall and how he handed the baton to me?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm handing it to you.
Mm,
And I want you to do everything you can to print books and other records and keep these things alive." And that's where I think I got the kind of commission to do what I was doing. Then,
gotcha.
of course, we got really serious and aggressive about finding out about the big book that needed to be done.
Right.
And so my dad, he selected the color. I had different color plates, and he just selected the color. He designed the cover, how it would look, his signature, those sort of things. Kind of came up with all of that. And then we talked a lot about, how the book could be done and if it could be done. And that's, well, probably not right now. We don't have the technologies to do that. But, in the day, it probably will. And actually, it was only about 3 or 4 years ago that, well, maybe about 5 years ago, they had actually invented a machine that has a roll that is small, like big old printing presses. The newspapers used to have these that could actually sew it together, so it was really nice, all in one thing. It would gather the signatures and then cut it, and then it would send it into to compile a book. And
Right.
so really, it just barely kind of happened. We were going to have R. Donnelly do it here in Utah, but during COVID, they went out of business.
Oh,
And they wanted a lot of money. And now we've kind of got this done a little bit cheaper. But that's kind of how the commission came for me to do what I'm doing.
got you. And then now putting the book together. You talked about that really the technology to get that big of a book to be able to be mass produced really wasn't around affordably until about 3 or 4 years ago. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
that's
And is
because now
that kind? Oh, go ahead.
now they can do it without plates and all the old style ink machines and all that. These type of machines, they just run a roll and it runs through a high-tech copy machine, and then it just does everything all in one row.
Gotcha. And so as you got, was it that 3 or 4 years ago where you were like, it just like hit you like, okay, now we're ready. We can do this.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it was around that time. We had compiled the you can see the green ones behind. I worked very hard to make that work so that like all the numbers would go all the way up to 4,700
Right.
pages, and it was all sequential and all in alphabetical order. Yeah, and so that's how we got it all set up. I think the hardest part was getting the indexing done. Oddly enough, uh, there was one point where we were trying to get all the indexes together. Like in one book, it would be page 5
Right.
where a certain subject was found, but then in the big book, it might be 3,499. And so you're like, how am I going to tell people where that is, and how do I even know where that is in the big book?
Right.
I was just stressed. I mean, my mind, I couldn't get past it. But I did find a lady, an indexer who would actually go in and index it, and her specialty happened to be in encyclopedic type things, just like what we had come up with.
Okay. So, and that brings me to the next question I had. Other than the indexing, what kind of what kind of challenges did you face putting together a book that big, right? I mean, it's hard enough to get a small book done and done right. It's another thing to do something that's that massive, right?
Yeah.
What other challenges did you face through this process?
Oh boy, it just went on and on. Um, I think the biggest challenges were money, finances, trying to get each of these books done, compiling and putting together each book into its own separate type of thing. I mean, these are little small books. We had to put them into an 8.5 by 11 format. That was difficult. And so, but we had to do all of that kind of type of computer work to make it actually happen. Um, there was one point, uh, that was a discouraging part with the indexing because indexing enough was hard enough. I mean,
Right.
index is really difficult by subject. And there's two index styles in here. One is a subject index, and then it's a subject, and then it gives kind of a little subtitle underneath it or next to it about that particular subject. That's a very common one. And then there's a word index where the computer went through and found every single place that, let's say, a subject like Brigham Young, would be every single, page number is on there. And some of those go 3 or 4 pages long. So so the word is very, very interesting.
Gotcha.
Where we had a hard time, so that was a discouraging time for me. I actually was about ready to give up. I mean, when we were trying to get this index to work, and before I found that indexer, I was just really discouraged. And oddly enough, Denver Snuffer calls me. And Denver,
Interesting.
yeah, and I knew Denver back in the day, and he bought a set of these green ones. Well, he did, and a friend of his bought it for him, and then he got it. And he calls me up and he says, Kevin, we obviously have differences of opinion about plural marriage and other things, but he says your dad's work is very comprehensive. It is very, very good stuff. And we can't even find these files anymore. A lot
Right.
of these archives have been shut down. A lot of places we can't get to. Some of these references are just, irreplaceable. And so please get your father's work done. Finish those books. Finish this thing. And then I hung up the phone and I'm sitting there. Denver Snuffer just called me, told me to get my dad's book done. It's like, wow, it must
Right.
be some sort of symbolic thing. And so I just got to it, and then that's when I found the lady, and we got the whole thing finished. In the actual process of this, in the writing of my dad, oh, and that's another one I forgot to tell you. So then, in the preface of all these, green books, I was right before it. I was trying to find something that I could write about the significance of the angel or whatever. And I just sat down, I prayed, and then I walked outside, pulled out one of my dad's notebooks, and out of the notebook fell this paper right on the ground,
Wow.
face. And I'm like, wow, what's that? And I looked down and picked it up, and it was the story of the angel that my dad had typed up.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, what are the chances of that? I took that, and that's where I put it in the frontis of the book. So it's
That was
actually,
my next question. You put that in the book.
yeah, that's the typed up
Excellent.
version.
Excellent. Um, as you were like trying to put things together, tell me about some of the what you would consider some of the miracles that happened as you were trying to get this book put together.
Well, one of the ones that kind of stands out, other than like the piece of paper that fell on the ground, was while it was being printed, it got printed, and they were trying to do the gold gilding. Now, gold gilding is it's kind of the yellow part on the sides.
Yep.
You can see the yellow on this, and that's a gold gilding they call it. And usually it's done with real gold, and then they heat it up and they stamp it on there, and it kind of shine. It's kind of shiny,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what Dad described, that it had some sort of gold gilding. And they tried to get it to work. They actually destroyed about 30 books just trying to figure out how to make it run and make it work. And the guy was pretty determined. He's like, nah, I'm gonna make it work. And so anyway, but he got it going and got them all printed, and they were getting ready to get them bound, and then they started trying to gild them, and it just did not work.
Mm.
They were having a real hard time, and it was the gilding was coming off, which meant that it didn't stamp right, and it was 2 months trying to delay on that, trying to get that figured out. We just couldn't get anything to work on it. And so I was getting pretty impatient, and I didn't know what to do. And so I knelt down and prayed, and I said, all right, Lord, you need to send that angel that brought the book, to my dad. You need
Right.
to have him go over there overseas and get this thing figured out. And the next day, I picked up the phone and I called the company, and I was about 10 minutes after they closed. And the phone forwarded or went to another phone, and a man answered it. And he said, hello. And we started talking, and he goes, you're who? And I said, I'm Kevin with Old Pioneer Press over in Utah. And he goes, oh, yes, yes, yes. We've been working on your book, and etc. And I said, he goes, how did you get my number? They don't forward this to my number. And he was really shocked. He goes, that's just really strange that it just went right to me.
Right.
So here he is, the owner, and he goes, let's try something else. Let's spray the gold on. I have a certain type that will, it's kind of more of a paint than the gold, and let's try that and see what happens. And so he tried it the next day, sent me a picture of it. I says, hey, it looks great. We'll go with it. And so within a week, we had it all done,
Oh, wow.
and we really shipped.
Gotcha. As you were compiling this book, right? It's all of your father's work, all of his writings. Did you have to do any other editing, or was it more just like, okay, here's Jesus is married, here's, the book on seer stones, the book on whatever, and just was it a matter of just dragging and dropping, so to speak, and then sending it to the printer, or did it take a little more work than that?
Oh, a lot of work, because now, I mean, you can talk to the editor girls. They had a hard time getting it all to fit on the sheets right. Now you're going from a small 5 by 8 book to now an 8.5 by 11 book. Um, there was a lot of layout problems. They'd bring it in, and then it would all be garbly. It wouldn't work, and they had to find the right way to bring it in. It was hours figuring it out. But once we had it figured out, then it would come in fairly quickly, and then we could make it go.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's go here. There was a couple of things that you mentioned you really wanted to go over as we talked about this, and I'm going to let you start it off. And if as I have questions, I'll let you know.
Okay, just kind of briefly, some of the main things that I wanted to bring out is some of the beautiful things and some of the fantastic stories that my family encountered while working on books.
Hmm.
Um, I remember my dad printing certain books like the Sears and Searstones book. And I've mentioned this before about Searstones. And my dad was printing that book because there was the anti-Mormon guy, Gerald Tanner, and
Uh-huh.
Gerald had written some pretty nasty stuff about anybody in any seer stone at all. And Dad's like, well, there were seer stones used, in the temple itself. The ephod had
Right.
12 seer stones, and then there was other seership type stones too, and there was a gentleman in the dream mine that was listening to Dad talk about this new book, Shears and Seer Stones. And he said, well, I have a seer stone. I have Joseph Smith's seer stone.
Mm.
And Dad said, really? And he says, yeah, I'll bring it. And he brought it and showed it to Dad. And he said, Dad was giving lectures at BYU and stakes and awards and different things. My dad sold most of these books. He was selling them at Deseret Book, and he was kind of out producing and outselling Bruce R. McConkie at that time.
Hmm.
So he was a well-known author. Jesus Married was a large, huge hit. I mean, people were really interested in it in that day, and so all the books kind of came out and made a pretty big impression. But anyway, about the seer stone. So he brought the seer stone and let Dad take it around to the lectures and tell the different things in the lectures. And then Dad brought it to me, and he'd handed it all over, and nobody really seemed to understand it or how that kind of thing works. But he handed it to me, and with my childlike, simplistic faith, I just kind of looked in it, and I could see anything I wanted, And Dad kind of freaked out. He goes, "Really? You can see stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, I saw this thing over here, and I found knives and old things that we'd lost, and all kinds of stuff." It was very interesting. And so the Sears and Searstone book kind of meant a lot to me. And I wish people would read it more. It's just very valuable.
I know you and I did a podcast on that one specifically because I was kind of interested in that.
Yeah, so that was a big one. The Three Nephites was a big one. I remember when it was being printed and Dad telling stories. The fascination of Dad was his storytelling, telling stories about people who had episodes with the Three Nephites and all the beauty of that. It was really, really interesting.
Fascinating. Okay. So as let's talk about that a little bit. Right? Because I think that this is well, before we go there, what was the other thing you wanted to cover? Let's do that.
The other thing I did cover in another one was, I think this is important because it says a lot about my dad and some of the people who had respect for him. Um, Hugh Nibley once told this thing because I was asking about Dad being excommunicated and all this. And he goes, "Oh, your dad can be saved." And he said, people would come to me asking about Adam God, and they wondered, about the church, and they were starting to lose their testimony. And the problem with the Adam God doctrine was Bruce McConkie said, "Well, Brigham, nobody ever taught it back then." And then the anti-Mormons came, and then they would show all the hundreds of places where it was taught and talked about. And so Dad was really upset with that because it's okay to say in history that we don't believe in that doctrine, or we don't admonish it anymore, and it was an old thing or whatever, or we just don't believe it's doctrinal. That's different than trying to change history and say that they never said it, because then it made them out to be liars.
Right.
So it was a really big deal and caused a lot of confusion. And so he would just say, go down to the library, get Ogden Kraut's book on Adam God, read it, and then come talk to me because I can't answer those questions in my position. And so they'd go down and read it, come back, and he said, they every single time they'd go, well, I got it figured out. Okay, thank you, you. And then they'd go back to doing their church work and whatever. And he said it was phenomenal. It was just really an important thing.
Mm, that's fascinating. As as you've done this now, right? You've got this, and look, you still have work in front of you. I don't want to make it seem like, okay, you're done now. You can close up shop and be done, right? That's not the case. You still got stuff to do. But with that said, what do you hope people take away from this book?
Well, my biggest thing is that when you look at all, let's just say we're all going to head to the wilderness, or we're going to go back to Jackson County, or you want to have one book, you live in an apartment, and you don't want to have the whole Journal of Discourses, you don't want to have the whole Millennial Star. I mean, I mean, just some of the journals could add up forever. I mean, Wilford Woodruff's journal is huge, and so if you could take all those and then put them in subjects, each subject, and then take all those references and all those things. And one of the things I want to emphasize about my dad, when he wrote his books, like Reincarnation or other ones, he would give both sides of the view. He would
Mm-hmm.
give this side and give this side, and then he'd give this side and let you make up your mind.
Right.
He told me a story once where he didn't know what to do because he was trying to teach the old ways of how we did it in the church so that people would know. And he was this big teacher in the stake. And so he got up and he would just say, now, in the old days, this is how they did it. He'd teach all the fundamentalist ways and all the old stuff. And they'd say, now, this is how we teach it today. And this is what we do. And this is why we do it. And, blah, blah, blah. And he'd have people come up who he knew liked the old ways, and they'd say, that was the best talk I've ever heard. Yeah, that was great. And then there were those who, believed in the modern view, and then they'd walk in, they'd say, oh, that was the best talk I've ever heard, because he got both sides. And
Right.
they saw the side kind of only, but that was how that was done. So that's a big, huge one. But just for all the simplified ways to see the old religion that was started by Joseph Smith, I think this is just an invaluable work.
Right. Right. Absolutely. So
Just
with
just
it, oh, go ahead.
just one quick thought. In United Order, my father teaches about tithing and how tithing was not done the way it is today, and how you had to have a United Order started before you even paid tithing. That's how it is in the Book of Mormon. This all things in common things going on, and then tithing came. And so that explains all of that in United Order and how it worked. And it worked very well. It wasn't like everybody paying 10%. Well, they kind of did, but they had to do it as a United Order, and it was on the increase of each
Mm,
year. So if you didn't increase any in a year, there was no tithing paid.
right. Wow. Holy cow. And then in this process of printing this work, did you gain like any new appreciation for what your dad had done?
Just sitting down and looking at the complexity of how he could honestly do this without a computer, I will never understand. And he did it because he had a photographic camera. Other than that, he wouldn't. I mean, Anne came in and was talking to him one day about the gift of dreams, and Dad said there was a picture that I want to put in here, and it was in this book, and it was printed this, and it has this picture, and it's a story about this man who had a dream. He was working on the sewing machine and he could never figure out how to make it work, how to loop it and how to have it come through. And then he had a dream, and these little natives were coming up with these spears and they were going to kill him. And the little points on the end had a hole in the tip of the
Mm,
spear. And then he got up and he went, "Oh my heck, if I put the hole instead of at the end at the tip, then the tip, it could go down and capture the other sewing." And that's how
right.
he was invented. And that was by a gift of dreams. And so that's, man, I want to have that article. And so he told her what magazine and where to go and about what page and what the picture looked like. And she went and found this thing, and she came back and she goes, "How many years ago did you see this?" And he goes, "I don't know, about 30 years ago." And she's, 30 years ago? You remember the page numbers and the very, what the book looked like and everything. So,
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So he definitely had some gifts to get this all done
yeah,
without the gift of technology.
right,
Whew.
right.
So if someone wants to get a hold of that book, Kevin, where can they get it from?
Okay, so we have a website called ogdenkraut.com. It's just his name, and then on it, when you first go in, it'll have the book itself, what it's about. It'll have the list of the actual number of books that's in it. The actual number of books that's in it is about 70 different books. So there's the list,
Holy cow.
72 books, 70 or 72 anyway. And this is what it kind of looks like on the website. It has like
Okay.
and then different things there. And then at the bottom of the page, there's a QR code. There's also the sale price. And then you can punch on the blue, and then that takes you to buy now. And so you can buy it with a credit card and we'll ship it out.
Nice. Now, I can edit this part out if this isn't the case, but we had talked back on Monday about maybe putting it on 1830mercantile.org. Is that something you wanted to pursue?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So yeah, you can go to 1830 Mercantile and find it there. Um, but I just feel like everybody needs a copy of this, right? Like I just there's money we have to spend out in Babylon right now. And I get that. But man, I think this book is going to be invaluable, right? Because if there's one thing that I could always respect about your dad's writings, and you kind of alluded to this beforehand, right? It was he was just going to give you the facts and kind of let you decide for yourself. He didn't pontificate a whole lot in his works. There were certain subjects that he definitely gave his opinion on, but by and large, your dad was more or less just a collector of documents and then allowed those documents to be seen in a certain format. You know what I mean?
Right.
And
Yes.
do you think your dad knew what he was doing there, or do you think that was just his default style?
Some of both. And some of the style of his writing, I mean, it was so inspired. One time I went to his print shop and it got late, and I was truck driving at the time, and I just said, I'm tired, I'm gonna go sleep in my truck. He says, "You can sleep in here." And so I slept on the sofa there, and he says, "Now be careful, because sometimes I get inspiration to come in and I type things on my computer in the middle of the night." And I said, "That's okay." And so, sure enough, 2 or 3 in the morning, he comes stumbling in, turns on the light, starts typing a bunch of stuff on the computer, and then, went back to stumbling out and went to bed. And I thought, that's interesting. And so I got up the next morning and I went in and I said, "So, Dad, tell me a little bit about what you wrote last night." He said, "I didn't write anything last night." I said, "No, you got up and went in and typed up a whole bunch of stuff."
Huh.
I don't remember that. I don't think I did that. And so he went in and looked on his computer, and here was this whole beautiful laid out. He said, "This is like the masterpiece that I've ever done." And he said, and how he said it was, well, we'll go see what the Lord had to say about this, or something. And so it was so inspired, you don't even remember. It was just, working right off the Spirit.
Wow. Wow. I have another question for you, and it's a little off topic for the book, but it's something I've wondered from time to time. What year did your dad pass away?
2002.
2002. So that's 23 years ago.
Yeah.
If you think back to what fundamentalism was like 23 years ago and compare it to today, what do you think your dad would think of the state of the religion now?
Well, he always said that it would be scattered and shattered, that there's vomit on all the tables, that there's problems. Um, but he used to always say, "I just don't know how it can get any worse. It's just the Lord's got to come. I just don't see it." And then the next year would be even worse, and so I think he kind of expected things to be out of order and a mess, and that's about how our world is right now. And the sad part to me, or the hard part for me to see, is that our children are not coming up in the ways of the Lord. They're not understanding these big book details, and we're losing it very quickly.
Why do you think that is, Kevin?
Satan.
Well, right, but I mean, what's he doing specifically to
you
keep us
know,
from that?
there was just kind of going off subject here. There's all these different fundamentalist groups. The church is kind of going more Babylon. There were all these things going on, and I have kind of an autistic kid, and I asked him when he was younger. I said, it's kind of explaining to him all the problems that's happening in some of the groups and some of the things that's going on, and how people are kind of moving into more different groups and smaller groups, and just all over the place. And my son looked kind of up in the air, and he said, "Oh, Dad, I see Satan." And I said, "You see Satan? Like right now?" And he goes, "Yeah, I see Satan." And I said, "Wow, what's going on?" And he says, "Well, Dad, Satan scattered the flock."
Hmm.
And so this is what's happened, is divide and conquer, which is what he's doing. And I see that a lot. And so instead of finding similarities and working with each other, we're all by our native instincts are dividing. And that's the scattered and shattered that was prophesied.
He would have had to have been somewhat pleased with the way things are going a little bit, though, right? I mean, there's never been a time where we could be more open as a people, right?
Right. That's true.
And so I think might be. I guess I look at it, and I guess maybe I'm maybe a little too optimistic, and that might be my issue. But I guess I look at it now, and look, there's one fundamentalist temple that has been built. There's another one that's about to start getting built. Um, there are, you know, fundamentalists are becoming kind of more mainstream, for lack of a better word, right? We're out there a little bit more. We're more in your in public discourse. So I think those are good things, right? Is everything perfect? But no, but I do think we're onto some good things, right? I don't know
Right.
if your dad would have saw it that way, but that's
He
kind of my
always
general sense
he
of
always
things,
saw the good and bad in things, and
right?
one of the things that he felt very strongly of is that a lot of people would start leaving the church. He says they're just going to leave in droves, Kevin. They're going to leave in droves, and it's our job to fill in the blanks and teach them these old principles.
Amen.
And and they're hungry. They're starving for information because after so many years of gospel fluff, we want some meat here. We're tired of drinking the milk, and this is where I think my dad shined. This is what this was all about, is to teach them those basic principles and what those are. There's a lot deeper fundamentalist doctrines there's a lot more things that I've got books here that go into real depth, and they're not for the mild-hearted, and so. But that's what God did with this book. He made it easy to understand. He wasn't like James Talmage, where he used big words. He worked very hard to make things in a layman's term where people could understand it. It wasn't complex. It wasn't overly complex. He had volumes. I can't remember which book it was, but he had probably 20 or 30 notebooks. And I looked at them all, and I said, Dad, there's got to be, you know 2,000 pages here, and he goes, yeah. And I've got to simplify that all down to about 300 pages. And so he would go off to Wendover or Vegas or whatever. And he'd get a room, and they'd just sit down and go through all that stuff for hours and hours and hours, where there wasn't phone calls, there wasn't interruptions, and just, get it simplified down easy.
You know, I look at guys like your dad who sometimes I look back at those times as, especially, the 40s through really the early 2000s is kind of the dark times, right? Where you have to be quiet, you have to keep your head down because you do not want to raise those animosities.
Yeah.
And I think one of the genius things that your father did, and I think it's reflected in that book you just showed, was as time goes along, it gets really easy to lose things, right? Really easy to lose things. And so as you try to put the picture back together, right? You have to be able to find the documentation to do it. And I think that was the mission that I think your dad fulfilled so well, was being able to give people the resources to put the puzzle pieces back in place, right? To be able to say, look, this goes here, this fits with that, and kind of put it all back together again. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So with that said, I feel like now is the time that we need to kind of reap the rewards of his hard work, right? I look at that book and I'm like, I think that needs to be in every Mormon's home. I really do.
There
Because
you go.
I think because that allows us to see the fuller picture. And again, it's largely an unbiased picture. He's just going to say, "Here's what I found." Now it's up to you for you to decide where you think it fits or not fits, right? And
Yeah.
I think that's hugely important in this work here. So, but dude, I can't wait for this book. Have you sold many yet?
Yeah. So quite a few. It's we've only had it for 3 or 4 weeks, so it's not been very
Right.
long. And people are grasping it. They're starting to see it. A lot of people said the very same thing as you said. Everybody should have this, just like the family Bible. It should be sitting in their house.
Right.
And because then they can get references, they can just look it up in the index, they can find whatever they're looking for. Look, we're not going to have computers in the future. I mean, the first thing that during a certain time, um, uh, can't remember his name now. He was on Fox. Tucker Carlson. First thing Tucker Carlson said after he got kind of canned, he came on and he goes, "Everybody needs to get hard copies of everything.
Yep.
If you have something important, print it out, put it aside, get it off the computers. You can't rely on the computers."
Right. Yeah. No, that's true. It's interesting as the temple here in Missouri was being close to being finished. There's one gentleman out here who said something very profound. And he said, "We this had to get done right now, or else we as fundamentalists would lose the importance of temples." And he said, "I think we were just one generation away." Right? Um, and I look at some of these teachings your dad preserved, and I think it's right there, right? We're one generation away from losing some of this. And you alluded to this, that we're having a hard time getting our kids to pick up the torch and keep running with it. And I just see this as one more tool to put in our arsenal as parents to just be able to do that. So,
Yeah.
but well, Kevin, what anything else you want to go over before we wrap this up?
Well, yeah, I would urge every family in the church, out of the church. A lot of people are leaving the church. You know, a lot of devastation kind of happened when Nelson uh, told people to kind of get the shot. A lot of
Yep.
people took that in a negative way. It was not a "Thus saith the Lord," and he certainly didn't do it over the pulpit. So there was a lot of controversy there.
Yeah.
Um, the big thing people need to understand that is in 1890 there was a covenant made with Wilford Woodruff and the conspirators, and during that time, um, we gave up a lot of these principles.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Denver Snuffer and other people, Nibley and others, said this is so valuable, is because these cover the principles before 1890.
Right.
After 1890, everything started going down in the church. And then the problem with people today is they start saying, well, my bishop's corrupt, my stake president's corrupt, BYU's corrupt, the president of the church told us to do terrible things, so the whole gospel is bad, and let's just throw the whole thing out.
Right.
And this is where we've got to pick up the reins and say, no, it was foretold that the drunkards of Ephraim and Isaiah would make a covenant with death and hell. And so the church did make that covenant, and the Lord's still with the church. He's still trying to get things to go. The missionary programs, it was all foretold by a lot of the people in the old days. Even in the Messiah Hancock Journal, there's a whole recording about what Joseph Smith said. He said in the last days that that there'd be doctors and lawyers and businessmen that would run the church. That was a horrible thing to be one of those back in the day. And so, they wouldn't know what's happening. They would do things that are kind of messed up. Brigham Young even made a quote, and he said, "I fear lest in the last days that this people, the people that run the
Mm-hmm.
church, will lead our people even unto the brink of hell."
Yeah.
And so here we are. We're in Babylon. It was a terrible thing to be part of Babylon in those days. The United Order and being together and working in unison, those were really high priorities of the people. Our ancestors, my ancestors walked the plains, and my great grandfather, uh, Robert McBride, he actually died. He was the one that carried the women and children across the plain, across the river, and they froze to death. And so, we made a lot of sacrifices for this religion, and so I urge people to get the books. I urge them to read them. There are some online that people can read. There's some YouTubes out there. I'm on a YouTube. You have some other YouTubes that talk about this. Let's get educated, understand why they lived what they did, and then one more thing: there is a website out there that I'm very fond of, and it's called earlymormonism.com. And I want people to reference to that because there's all the different journals of the pioneers on there. There's just hundreds of them. And my dad used to say that these journals, Joseph Smith said, you people write down these experiences because these will be almost quoted as scripture. Your journals will almost be quoted as scriptures by your posterity. And so now we're seeing a lot of that fulfilled. One of the reasons why my father not only did this type of work, but he preserved a lot of journals, probably
Mm-hmm.
50 to 100 journals. And what I heard him say was that there was a man in the archives of this church who, if it had anything spiritual or a little controversial or he didn't like or whatever reason, he'd take the journal, take it out and back, throw it in the dumpster. Or we also heard that it may have been a 55-gallon barrel, and throw it in the barrel and light it on fire and burn it up.
Oh, jeez.
And so
Oh.
dad would get the journal and he would copy the journal or take photos of it, because he had his little spy cameras. He worked for the
Mm-hmm.
government. And then he would reprint the journals and then bring them into that guy and hand them to him and say, okay, I've got 500 copies out there. So even if you burn it up, it's not going to do any good.
Right.
And I was working for a tiler, and he was doing tile work. And I told him that story, and he knew my dad, and we knew him, and his name was Mike. I won't tell his last name, but Mike told me, he says, I know the very person that did that, and so I just want you to know that was um, one of the major things that was happening. Amy, yeah. So um, so he verified that story that actually happened.
Wow.
So we want people to understand the journals and the histories of those people. I just heard one the other night, and my dad had it recorded, and it was a journal about Lorenzo Snow coming and giving this girl a blessing. And this girl, she actually went to bed, and she said, in the morning at 10 o'clock, they're coming to get me. I'm gonna die.
Hmm.
And so, sure enough, at 10 o'clock sharp, poof, she's dead. And Lorenzo Snow comes in, they invite him in and do this, and he goes, she's not supposed to go. I think she's supposed to be here. She has a mission. She needs to come back. And so he went in, and it had been about an hour that she was dead or something, an hour or two or something. Anyway, and he lays his hands on her head, and he says, come back, come back, come back. And then he gives her this blessing, and then he leaves. He's out of there because he knows she doesn't want to come back. And then it was a little while after that. Then she comes back to life, and she's looking around the room. And she says, "Where's Brother Snow?" And she was pretty upset. She wanted to chew him out, and he wasn't there. He's gone, and so it was a pretty fantastic story. And you think about, there's so much controversy, so many things that people say bad about Brigham Young and John Taylor and Lorenzo Snow. All those
Right.
people say are bad. Everything after Joseph was evil and terrible and all these horrible things. And I've got stories about Brigham Young. Yeah, he made a lot of mistakes. John Taylor and him didn't get along, and there were some real issues with Brigham. But Brigham had some inspiration. He,
Absolutely, he did.
tons of things that he prophesied that have come true. Tons of things that he did. One story was really fascinating. I'll close this up, but I'm just trying to emphasize
Yeah, no, you're good.
and how important it was. There was up one of the canyons here. I think it was Little Cottonwood Canyon, and they built a mill. Now, in the old days, in the mill, they had this
Mm-hmm.
water mill, and then it ran everything. It ran power tools, it ran things, and they had this big sawmill, and they'd cut the logs and cut them into pieces, and it was quite a thing. And it all run by water. And these guys are out there, and every time they turned around, their tools were missing. And they got kind of mad at each other, and they were blaming, you stole my tool. No, I didn't steal it. You stole mine, and they going back and forth and having this problem. And well, we just have to find out what's going on. And Brigham came up there to see how things were going. And they told him about this story. And Brigham walks around, and he looks up in the sky and kind of prays a little bit about it and walks around a little bit more. And then he comes back and he says, brethren, he said, this very spot is now being commanded by the Gadiantans from the other side.
Hmm.
And it's said in the Book of Mormon that your treasures will become slippery. They're stealing your tools. And so these beings from the other side are taking this. And he said, so the only way we're going to get away from this is to tear down the whole mill, take it upstream and on the other side of the river, and then we'll place it there, and we'll never have a problem again. And
Wow.
I'll send a crew up to help. So they came up and tore this whole thing down. moved it across the river, set it on the other side, and never had a problem after that.
Wow. You know, people are hard on those early brethren, right? And I want to say this. If you're looking for a perfect man to be a prophet, you're going to look for a long, long time and never find it, right? And I look in the scriptures and I don't see anywhere that tells me that prophets are infallible, right? Moses kills a man. Isaiah has unclean lips. Jonah runs from God. Peter denies the Christ, right? Go on and on and on. And we have a lot of grace and a lot of forgiveness for those guys. But for some reason, those early restoration leaders, we don't, right? People tend to really want to just come down hard on them. I imagine it's probably because they're closer to us in the proximity of time than those Old Testament and New Testament prophets, right? But
Right.
nonetheless, despite their flaws, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, up to Joseph F. Smith, all those guys were still prophets, doing the best they could in some really horrific circumstances, right? Um,
Right.
and I've done plenty of podcasts that illustrate that even Wilford Woodruff, he signed the manifesto, but he also kept the principle alive, right? He
Right.
made sure that guys like Cowley, John W. Taylor kept going. And I think that's something hugely important to remember. Especially, I'm not a fan of trashing the ancestors, so to speak, right? Um, I'm sure someday, if it goes that long, our great great grandkids will look back on us and go, "Those people were savage," right? And I think we need to keep that in mind, right? Is that be gentle with them. They did the best they could, and quite frankly, they left us a heck of a legacy to stand on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, John Taylor, I can't even account how many times that he had claim of seeing the Savior and having these experiences, and it just breaks my heart. I had a guy come in here the other day, and he's talking about this Joseph Smith movie, Who Killed Joseph, and them shooting the actual watch, and how that was all a lie because they shot it at this angle and all that. And so I just typed in the internet, being saved by objects. And there's hundreds of people in World War II that had
Oh yeah,
those little Bibles, and the little Bible had a bullet stuck in it. And stopwatches. There was a German soldier that he was up there. It was an officer, and he got shot, and it got hit this pocket watch, just same as John Taylor saved his life. Who's to
look,
say that doesn't happen? But we don't see it the way because we want to see something fault wise with the church. We want to see something fault wise with these men, and and when you get in that fault finding mode, instead of looking at the good or the beauty of what they had done, and what I mean, Lorenzo Snow saw the Savior walking down the steps in the temple.
right,
I mean, this is how close these men were to God and to this beautiful concept. And for us to trash that or trash our ancestors or talk bad about what they went through. I mean,
yeah,
they went through tremendous things that we could never go through.
absolutely,
Really, really tough.
absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's part of your father's legacy too, right? Is just preserving this for us, right?
Correct.
And I look at those early brethren in church leadership, and I see something similar there. So, well, man, that's good stuff, Kevin. I'm super excited to get this up. So, um, yeah, go check out ogdenkraut.com to get the book, or you can go to 1830mercantile.org. It's all right there. We're gonna put all of Kevin's books up there for him. So, just one place you can go where you can find them all at the same time. Kevin, I'm excited to see what you're gonna work on next. Any ideas?
Well, we're going into Mormon history with these journals. So we're going
Awesome.
to do some complete compilations of journals and finishing up all of my dad's smaller work to make sure all those books are available. I don't know. Everybody's really searching right now, and it's a beautiful time to get into this type of subject and study it out.
Absolutely. Furthermore, you give your local fundamentalist podcaster more fuel to talk about. So that's always good too.
That's good.
So, but anyway, Kevin, dude, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, man.
Thank you.
All right. We'll do it again soon. All right.
Okay.
Hang out for just 5 minutes. Bye, everybody.